Hey, I'm Britta, and I technically work for a little tiny part of the government, but this is me talking on my personal time. That's the thing you kind of end up having to say when you work for the government. It's cool, actually. If you want to work for the government on technical writing, you can talk to me later. But the thing that I really want to talk to you about today is that, do you want federal agencies to release their code as open source projects with really good documentation? Like, would this be a magical, wonderful world where almost all government code was open source? Well, it could happen. The White House Office of Management and Budget is trying really hard to make this happen because there's this national action plan for open government. And people think, well, if more code was open and there was more public input, opportunities for public review, there'd probably be fewer security problems because people would write it correctly the first time. And there would probably be fewer like healthcare.gov style meltdowns because somebody would have noticed a little earlier that something was completely smelly. So, the White House has committed to adopting a government-wide open source software policy. And this is open for public comment right now. It's at sourcecode.cio.gov, and it's a fairly interesting policy. It goes through things about acquisitions and procurement, but the really interesting part is that it has a number of recommendations about how agencies should release open source code in a way that engages communities and engages the broader just public. And they're trying to do this themselves. The White House has a GitHub organization, and they put this draft policy up on GitHub pages, essentially, and you can comment on it by writing a comment on GitHub. You can send a pull request. They're not going to accept it. It'll be like a pull request for commentary if you want to like suggest a specific edit to the policy. And there are all sorts of interesting people coming in and commenting, but there's only, I'd say, 55 threads open right now. There's a lot more people who have open source experience who aren't showing up yet. And it has a few parts that are specifically about documentation that I wanted to point out. It's trying to, this is just a screenshot from the policy, you don't have to read it. It's trying to, first of all, encourage government-wide code reuse. So not all government code, they don't really expect that they can get all of the agencies to release all of their code publicly, but they do think that they can get agencies, they can realistically require agencies to share code within government. And as part of that process, they need to get the procured code to actually come with code and documentation. So it has a list of requirements here that include the vendor who's running the software has to deliver some documentation. So this might be a fun thing to read over and make sure it actually makes sense in the details. It also has some recommendations, actually requirements, for agencies releasing custom developed source code. And it has a really specific set of README requirements. And I don't know if they've done a whole lot of open source development before. They're kind of guessing here and hoping that people will comment on whether these recommendations make sense. Do these make sense as requirements? Should they be recommendations? I don't know. People should comment on it. Yes, read the whole thing. It's not even that long. It's it'll take you 10 minutes. And public comment closes on April 11th. You can comment on things they're also going to develop something called Project Open Source, which is a set of recommendations to go along with the requirements. So if you just want to suggest recommendations for agencies, rather than thinking about the bureaucratic design of policy, that's great too. All right, that's all I want to tell you. My name is Britta. If you want to work for the government, talk to me. It's fun. All right.